All right, welcome everybody. My name is Clionadh Raleigh. I am the CEO and President of ACLED, and today I will be moderating as our Head of Analysis, Dr. Andrea Carboni, talks about our annual report on violence targeting local officials for 2023. We will also, of course, be speaking about the 2024 patterns we've noticed thus far, and we welcome your questions at the end of a short presentation by Andrea. First, I again would like to welcome everybody. We are very grateful that you've given us some of your time today for this brief discussion about this very important topic. Of course, what we've seen in the last few years is contested elections, highly charged political campaigns, public demonstrations, and populism have increased the rate of local official targeting worldwide. The increasing attention to the threats and violence experienced by local officials across the world is welcome, and we hope that this report gives some sustenance to that discussion. We, of course, see widespread concerns for local officials in the United States. Just this last weekend, there was a report in the New York Times about that. In Mexico, the election, of course, on June 2nd in certain areas is already causing quite a lot of violence. And further in Afghanistan, India, and Ethiopia as some examples, but indeed almost every country has experienced violence against local officials in the recent past. So 94 countries were recorded as having some violence targeting local officials in 2023. But we are curious about whether or not these trends are unique. Are they growing as democratic practices are contested? And who and why would target local officials? So this project of ours, Violence Against Local Officials more broadly, combines both the data that we've covered, as Andrea will discuss, and the analysis of these trends to reveal proliferation and depth in countries considered to be in conflict, which of course has a lot of targeting of different scales of governance and civilians. But we're also seeing a very high rate of violence targeting local officials in countries that are largely peaceful. And this project is in part revealing that because local governance is in fact prolific across all countries, violence against local officials is often the most obvious and accessible frontline of conflict. And this is significant because violence against officials who occupy regional and local seats tells us about how violence is shaped by the type and form of local authority and competition. So one of the things that motivated this project and this report is who has power and who wants to take it from them. And of course, underlying all of this is our insistence that these attacks are not mistakes, they're not collateral damage, they're targeted attacks on these members of the formal government system, or of course, workers within that. But I'm going to turn it over to Andrea now, who will guide us through a brief presentation, and then we'll have a discussion about some of these patterns. So Andrea, please go ahead.
Thank you, Clionadh. Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to present our first annual report, like the findings from our first annual report on violence against local officials. I want to echo what Clionadh mentioned about the significance of this topic, local governance being an integral component of state governance all around the world, and their targeting being, I'd say, a matter of concern for all communities, all people that are affected by this phenomenon, which, as we shall see, is majority of the countries in the world, is more than 100 countries and territories that are seeing at least one, that saw at least one event last year. We also believe that this is an important and to date, I'd say, understudied topic, at least from a global perspective. There are many organizations and researchers working on this topic, often kind of on the country level or on the regional level, but it's one of also the challenges that we encountered in designing the study, I'd say, was exactly the lack of any existing work from a global perspective. So before getting into the findings, I just wanted to give a glimpse of the methodology and the definitions that we applied to our to the topic of our work. We track events wherein violence is perpetrated against local government officials and public or private property that belongs to local officials or local government. We apply, I'd say, a very conservative, restrictive definition of local government officials, which include only members of subnational government institutions, ranging from first-level administrative divisions to cities, towns, villages. So we are focusing on, let's say, members of state administrations. Examples may include governors, mayors, city councillors, but also employees of local administrations, local election workers, for example, all other members of subnational administrations. And we do not only code and record attacks against, I'd say, the individuals, but also against, as I mentioned before, public or private properties. So town halls, polling stations, vehicles or residencies that belong to local administrators, they all, I'd say, reflect the various threats and I'd say that, you know, local administrations are faced in their everyday work. What we do not cover is, of course, the whole range of threats that do not result in violence and cases of interpersonal violence, which are, of course, something that goes beyond the scope of our work at ACLED. I would also say that those of you who are interested in actually analyzing the data beyond what we are providing here in this report can access the data freely by either downloading our curated file from the dedicated page on our website, or even download the full data set and filter the tags column using the local administrators market. We introduced a new tag last year, and again, every user can carry out their analysis. And again, just a last point, ours is also a living data set, which means that we regularly update information. As Clionadh mentioned, our coverage doesn't stop at 2023, but goes well into 2024, and we try to update, of course, our data as new information becomes available. I'll move on to the main findings of this report, which, as I mentioned, covers primarily 2023. We record close to 2,500 events globally in just 1 year, and this is down by approximately 11% from 2022. Overall, there are 94 countries affected, and also the number is down from, I think, 101 of the previous year. The most common type of violence that we record are direct attacks, again on local officials. Approximately, we're talking about 40% of all recorded events. In our own kind of definition of direct attacks, we mean kind of aggressions that may be carried out by organized groups, organized armed groups. Often they may be unidentified armed groups, or maybe rebels, militias, state forces, and include actions like physical aggressions, abductions, targeted assassinations, or even assassination attempts. And actually, in around half of all recorded cases of violence against local officials, unidentified armed groups are responsible for the violence. This is important because it speaks to a number of dynamics, either the impunity, for example, that many of these groups enjoy, or the fact that there are no that they do not claim responsibility for the attacks, which again speaks to the nature of these groups. Sometimes they may be more kind of criminal or political in nature, depending on the cases. The second most common form of violence in 2023 are riots, accounting for approximately 30% of all incidents worldwide. And they increased by 38% compared to 2022. This is again relevant because if we look at the countries in which riots particularly increase, so more spontaneous forms of violence, so forms of violence happening during demonstrations, for example, or carried out by mobs, we see that these countries include places like Colombia, Guatemala, Bangladesh, all of them holding elections or local elections or preparing for elections last year. But also France, as we shall see later, France recorded a notable increase in the incident of riots where local officials were ultimately targeted. And we'll see perhaps also in the discussion why and the kind of the drivers of these violence. If we look at the geographic diffusion of the phenomenon, the Asia-Pacific region is the one that tops the list. Is of course a very broad region, also encompassing many very populous countries. But the only region across the board that records an increase compared to the previous year, to 2022, is Latin America and the Caribbean, which moved from 558 events in 2022 to 580 in 2023. And again, this is linked especially to some countries where that drove the trend. Taken together, then we have 5 countries which account for approximately 40% of all events worldwide. These countries are India, Myanmar, Mexico, Colombia, and Nigeria. All very populous countries, all with, I'd say, a very rich, diverse forms of local authorities. Some of these countries had elections, especially, again, local elections last year. Others, of course, like Myanmar, are in the midst of kind of an active conflict, while others are characterized by the presence of armed groups, criminal gangs coexisting with violent, for example, electoral competitions or competitions between multiple political groups. And a final point I wanted to highlight that the largest increase from 2022 to 2023 is recorded in a country that is, of course, not considered to be a country at war or a country witnessing severe conflict, actually in a region that shares these characteristics, France. There were 12 times more events in 2023 than those recorded in 2022. And again, they were linked to a wave of demonstrations that especially rocked hundreds of towns in France between June and July, and before in March and April. So just very briefly to summarize the main findings, of course, there are many that are related to each country and to each country or to each region, and I encourage everyone to read through the report, and we'll go probably through some of these case studies in our discussion with Clionadh. But before moving on to that, I wanted perhaps to throw, let's say, 3 main themes, main trends that we see, I'd say, across the world. The first element, I'd say, concerns the impact of elections on the risks faced by local officials. And we see that indeed election cycles, especially those linked to local elections, are kind of heightening the risks for local officials. We saw that in 2023, gubernatorial, municipal, and other subnational elections were associated with higher levels of violence against local officials in several countries: Colombia, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, just to mention a few of them. And I'd say that threats to elected but also appointed officials arise from candidates, groups are attempting to influence the electoral outcome. But we also have, for example, organized criminal groups that aim to impose control over incoming local administration. So it's a way of intimidating everyone entering politics. But at the same time, we also have, and this is of course something that intersects with these dynamics, violent incidents linked to anger over alleged irregularities, fraud, which often is directed at, again, the symbols of local administrations or local election workers, and so on. A second theme that I think is particularly interesting, and again is shared by many in many contexts, is the strategies that armed groups, rebel militia groups and beyond, using, of course, in their activities. And we see that a number of these groups target local government officials with the deliberate intent of exposing state weakness, sometimes retaliating against perceived enemies or rivals, but also kind of with the intent of creating vacuums in governance that they can then fill in. And again, this is a common strategy that we see in places like the Sahel, in Somalia. I'd say they are very even long-tested strategies, because they haven't been applying these like for the past couple of years, but it's actually, in some cases, we're talking about a decade-long strategy of targeting local officials. And finally, a theme that, of course, is kind of driving in many cases the riots or even individual aggressions on local officials, and I say relates to the role that political polarization and kind of a general dissatisfaction with government performance are playing in driving these forms of violence. This is something that is increasingly turning into a concern in a region like Europe, for example. We saw declarations by some European institutions, by some European governments, introducing new legislation to protect local officials, although this is not limited to it. And again, the idea and the data show that kind of riots over a number of issues pertaining to government performance are very common, are very widespread from, again, Europe, but also Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, South America, Central and South America, as well as Africa and beyond. I'll stop here. I'll pass it over again to Clionadh, and we can go in depth into these topics.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I've got a few questions for you just to bring out some of the excellent themes that you have noted. But I'll first say that the countries that you mentioned, the 5 countries that you mentioned taking up 40% of the overall violence against local officials, 4 of those are extremely violent on our conflict index. And another thing, India is the one that is not of those top 10, but I believe it's in the high category. But another thing that was so interesting about that presentation is that, of course, these officials are subject to a multitude of risks, not simply from one group or from one type of political ideology, but rather quite a number of different risks and threats that they have to deal with. And I thought that was nicely brought out in the report itself. There are some summaries that I think are really important, of course, given what you were talking about. The threats come from three sources. One is, of course, attempts to dismantle cogs in the system. And you mentioned in the report that outside of elections, the rebel and militia groups frequently identify local officials as low-cost yet high-profile targets, and use the Sahel as a good example of this. Another, of course, is Somalia, where in the report you note that in 2022 and 2023, Al-Shabaab was especially active. In fact, it killed more people than it had events in attacks towards local officials. Why do you think that happened during those years? And it's gone way down now. In fact, I think we record only 15 events for 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the idea of the multitude of risks. I think it's also one of the reasons why, for example, it's very difficult in some contexts to identify the exact identity of the perpetrators, and there is a sort of cloud that allows many actors to take advantage of, for example, the presence or the incidence of organized crime to wage violence, to settle maybe their scores with local officials for own reasons that are separate from organized crime. Of course, the incidence, the prevalence of organized crime in some regions is often a driver of these violences. Is why they want to keep a tight control over local government, but it's also an element that provides others with, I'd say, plausible deniability for the responsibility, or just with the opportunity. We mentioned, of course, in some context, and you kind of highlighted in the report that we describe, let's say, the low-cost tactics when it comes to the targeting of local officials. I'd say that we apply that label because, I mean, this is almost an evident feature, but there are more local officials than there are national ones. And while, of course, national officials are often a very high-profile target, they tend also to be much better protected than local officials. In many cases, we have countries or governments that may not be able to provide security to their representatives because of their troops may be stretched thin, if you want, or they are not able to identify threats from within. You mentioned two cases there, like the Sahel and Somalia. And Somalia, for example, is one case where it's been difficult to stop many attacks from Al-Shabaab, not just on local officials, but those are typically very high profile, targeting even the very well protected buildings of Mogadishu municipality, of Banadir municipality in particular. Because they use, of course, they have, their own, they are able to infiltrate the ranks of the armies or the government. So in this sense, they are unable, and this is the role, of course, of the intelligence service to identify those threats from within. In the Sahel, of course, it's another, might also be that kind of set of problems, but you have governments that have been unable to prevent the stop, or either by their own lack of ability, or the kind of a deliberate strategy that probably spiraled out of control, to prevent the insurgency of especially Al-Qaeda or Islamic State linked groups. And that's of course a major issue, because the moment you lose control over your territories, you're not necessarily the peripheries of the country, actually it could be any province, any region. Well, by that moment, you create a space for those armed groups to fill in. And I was mentioning before the idea that they can provide those services that the state, at the moment that you decapitate the figures embodying the state at the local level, are no longer able to provide. And so that's where they come in, and that's how they also can consolidate their control over territories.
Very good. I think those two examples, the Sahel and Somalia in particular, really suggest an important kind of correction to how we often think about conflict, which is many people often believe in a common narrative that locations of violence are ungoverned or undergoverned. And at the very least, conflict occurs in these ungoverned space. But there are agents of governance everywhere, of course, and not necessarily solely security forces. And because it's so prolific, it in fact can invite attacks on it, because it's so apparent. And of course, as you note, they represent the institutions most proximate to the citizens while still representing some elements of the state, even if the state is not necessarily overly present within those regions. But the Somalia example and the change over time really indicates that when no longer under massive pressure, when no longer really contesting and in competition with, let's say, a resurgent Somali National Army, Al-Shabaab didn't go after as many local officials, because it seems to be a response to competition. So the competition either from local forces or from federal forces or from national forces or whatever the case, it's being shaped by that. And I think that no more so than in elections, right? These are cases where there's obvious governance. People are running for office, right? And if you can speak a little more about who you think is behind some of the election-based conflicts, that I think would be really interesting to the listeners.
Yeah, so of course, elections are very much linked to the topic of our report, simply because many of these officials may be elected, so they may have gone through the electoral process. Others may have just been appointed by the center, and they do not go through that process. In general, we see in the data, and especially in some cases, Mexico, Nigeria, I can mention definitely India, that there is a sort of I don't want to use maybe the word correlation, because it might be very strong, but like there is I'd say they share the same patterns with increasing violence. So there are local elections, and you see a correlation between the holding of local elections and the violence against local officials, even more than the national ones. Although, as we see, for example, this year in Mexico, and we've been examining, these process through a series of reports, we see that there is an increasing pattern, even in Mexico, against candidates in particular, not necessarily they are all local officials, but also against, councillors who may be running, or councillors who are, or mayors who are overseeing even the electoral process. In general, again, we can say that basically local officials may be acting as, sometimes I'd say they are targeted because they are power brokers. They may be considered kind of power brokers, or they may have a role in, as I was mentioning before, like in overseeing the process. And so intimidating those who are in charge of registration, in charge of counting the votes, or all of the electoral mechanics is a powerful message that you send, and then also to influence the outcome. But sometimes, and this is maybe another kind of important element, they're also party leaders. And so the violence in many cases doesn't stem only from inter-party competition. You may have a number of cases where, for example, a rival party candidate is not only suspected but also found responsible of either ordering the assassination of the rival, of a local administrator. But sometimes it's even within the party, because the competition doesn't stem just from between the parties, but also within, for being listed in the party, for being included in the party list for in the elections. And I think it it points also to another element, that local institutions matter in general, that give power to office holders, and this power is sought by many. And so that's why elections, but it can be also, again, it can be elections held publicly, but also those within parties, or for different levels of the governance system, that matter and heighten this competition, which may lead in many cases to violence.
I find that really fascinating, because I think, again, one of the preconceptions, along with this notion of ungoverned space, which you have noted is largely untrue, is this notion that this is some sort of indictment about the quality of democracy. But if it's intra-party competition as much, if not more, than it's inter-party competition, that says quite a lot about the process of democracy isn't necessarily peaceful, and it's not necessarily, let's say, without its trade-offs about how people get and retain positions. So thanks for that. We came up with a lot of those examples in South Africa too, within the ANC especially. So I'd like to just have you speak a little bit about the forms of this type of violence that it tends to take. And of course, we mentioned fatalities here, but often it's not necessarily the official themselves who gets killed, but bodyguards, family members, etc. What are the other forms of conflict that we're seeing high levels of? And in particular, if you can note Nigeria's banditry crisis, or the kidnapping crisis there, and how that stems into this issue.
Yeah, I'd say, well, of course, like the disaggregation of our data makes it difficult, for example, for us to count every single official that is killed, because as you see, sometimes, as you say, sometimes these attacks cause a number of fatalities of bodyguards or bystanders or other people working alongside the I'd say the target. We know that, for example, we mentioned Al-Shabaab before. Al-Shabaab is one of the groups that, when it comes to attacks against local officials, is one of the most, I'd say, lethal. It causes the most fatalities. And there is also, I'd say, almost an evident reason, in the sense that these attacks, especially those carried out in Mogadishu or in areas controlled by the federal government, are maybe heavily protected. And that means that, I'd say that they have to use strategies, or things like suicide vehicle-borne IEDs that are intended to cause a lot of fatalities. So there is, there you have also to make a difference between the different groups that are carrying out, and of course the capabilities that they have, the weapons that they use. I'd say Nigeria is, I think, is a very interesting case, and again, the I'd say the results that we get when it comes to local officials are reflective of the various security crises that are present in Nigeria at the moment. We mentioned elections, of course, and the fact that the elections that Nigeria held relatively, I'd say, peacefully compared to previous cycles, still resulted in several attacks, and Nigeria had, I think, more than 130 attacks across the year, the most recorded in one single country in Africa. And again, most were linked to the, especially the gubernatorial elections that were held in 3 cycles, if I'm not wrong, during the year in different states. But then you also have, I'd say, the legacy or the outcome of the banditry crisis in not only in the Northwest but also elsewhere. And there is an interesting dynamic, and of course there is also research about that. But basically, many local officials, again, in Nigeria, in Northwest Nigeria, are also victims of abductions, for example. So it's not just about communities. We know many students, schools being targeted by rural bandits and, kidnapping en masse, I'd say. But sometimes it's probably even kind of easier logistically to some extent to target one person, one figure, in this case, maybe local officials. And what happens is that since, local official is an important figure within the community, oversees a number, may oversee not just maybe civilian, I'd say civilian affairs, but also could be military or even vigilante groups, like recruitment for groups or for military affairs. They make local officials like a lucrative prize, and they are like the ransom that comes with the kidnapping of local officials is typically higher, because it forces communities to pool money to pay the ransom. And again, this is something that we saw in at least 20 states in Nigeria. We recorded abductions in at least 20 states in Nigeria in 2023, which is a kind of high number. Again, some of these were linked to the election cycle, and so kind of short-lived abductions, but in many cases were actually linked to banditry and I'd say more kind of crime, the sprawling crime.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's a very thorough answer, and I think it really underscores they are being attacked, or they are at the mercy of attacks from multiple different types of groups, but they're also faced with a number of very different types of attack and legacies of that type of violence. I'm going to turn a little bit now just to some comments and some questions from the audience. Mamadi Konde said, thank you for the wonderful presentation, which I agree with, Andrea. I have a question regarding the increase in violence and conflict at the beginning and the end of election cycles and its effect on women's participation in politics. Women are often targeted, which of course you know. What impact does this have on women entering politics and the effort to increase participation? Maybe if you could just summarize very quickly what we found, if there was a gender disparity, and I would say the notion that there is a unintended but also invisible effect, which is people not entering politics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, our data reflect, I think, the more limited participation of women in politics, and so we have 88 cases in which we could identify the identity of we could identify actually the identity of the targeted officials as women, which is very low number, if you want, but again, reflects both the participation and sometimes reflects the lack of information in the reports, in the sources, in the news outlets that we use. More than half of these cases were recorded in Mexico, the Philippines, India, Colombia. Again, it's kind of in line with the general trends we observe. There is research, increasing research on how violence, and I wouldn't say just violence, but also harassment and threats are having an impact on women participation in politics. A recent study by Bridging Divides, for example, finds that at least in the United States, women officials are, I'd say, disproportionately more likely to report being insulted, harassed, and threatened. And again, these leads women to either sometimes, of course, not in all cases, but leaves women with a decision to either leave politics or not enter politics at all, and contributing in general to depressed participation of women in politics. So this is a major issue, I think, for democratic politics in general, in the sense that not being able to protect everyone, and of course women, since they are underrepresented in politics more broadly, it's a major issue for how people participate and take part in politics. There is also another research, another kind of piece of research that I read recently, which shows that, again, in the United States, where there is more work on this topic, women, and especially younger women or women of color, tend to, of course, earn less than other categories. And since they earn less, they also are less likely to be able to pay for protective measures, which are kind of left to the individual, to the kind of individual politicians, which is also probably another kind of distortion of politics. And so it creates a cycle whereby women are then left more exposed to these kind of threats. I'd say it's a combination of factors, but definitely there is a disproportionate toll that is affecting women even more than men. Again, even if the absolute numbers tell us a story that perhaps women are less targeted, but that is discounting a number of other factors.
Great, thank you very much. We have some questions. Abdi Fattah has asked about the kind of details of the data, all of which is in the report, so I highly recommend people read it. Zemelik, hello Zemelik, has asked about the extent of data on the attacks of local officials in Ethiopia. That is updated throughout, like all the countries, all of our typical coverage. But I will take this moment to ask about 2024 patterns, Andrea, and whether or not there's anything there that you would see as an anomaly or something that's striking you as different from the 2023 patterns you went over here.
Currently, I mean, our data, as mentioned, like, are updated on a weekly basis. So we try to make sure that even the identification of all the events targeting local officials are being included as timely as possible. But the current trends are, I'd say, in line to some extent with what we've seen last year. I'd say that there are, of course, some trends that are quite notable for though linked to, I think, the themes that we explored before. I'd say, first of all, it's like the impact of elections. Of course, this is a year that has been branded as the year with most elections in history. For example, that definitely we see an increase in the number of such attacks in Mexico, or a continuation of attacks against local officials in India, and particularly in some regions within India, West Bengal, Kerala, among other states, are seeing an incident. And particularly when it comes, for example, to West Bengal, this is not a kind of an outlier. It's something that has been also present in India's recent history. There were other occurrences in previous electoral cycles. Another element is France, which I mentioned in my my initial presentation. We could potentially say that what we saw last year in terms of the spike, which brought France to be the country with the most number of events in Europe and seeing the largest increase worldwide, was somehow, I hadn't say short-lived, but was definitely linked to a very specific dynamic, which was the kind of the indignation and the demonstrations that followed the killing of a 17-year-old in the suburbs of Paris. That actually led to an outbreak of, I'd say, unprecedented violence, even if our coverage is limited to the past 4 years for Europe, but like an unprecedented wave of violence in France, which still led the government, the French government, just in March to pass new legislation to protect local officials, which is somehow, which has, warned many against the threats faced by several mayors in France, for example. And this is, again, not just limited to France, but actually in Europe. There is, and maybe to add to my answer, there is increasing concern around the European elections. For example, over the past few weeks, we've seen a number of, I'd say, individual attacks against not just local officials in this case. Well, there was definitely an aggression, for example, against a state senator in Germany. There were, these past few months, attacks on politicians in the Netherlands, in Germany again, against the prime minister in Slovakia. But there is, I'd say, an increasing focus on the role that political polarization is playing in Europe, in particular, again, because Europe was not, I'd say, used to, at least in the past few years, in the past maybe 1 or 2 decades, to such level of violence, and so this is something that, of course, we are continuing to monitor, and potentially the idea is also for us to expand and go beyond just the local officials, which are, again, just one component of governance, but also to include entire politicians at large, which would probably give even a broader picture.
No, I'm very excited about it. I will not subject everybody to our discussion about subnational governance and violence in our special issue of Civil Wars. That will be a different webinar. But so Andrea and I have spent about 5 years discussing this very topic. So we've said a lot about it. I'm going to have 2 more questions, one from James Wooten, and it's about the modality by which we can collect this information, and then the other about what can people do about this, or what are governments doing about it? So from James, we only know that an attack, disruption, and violent protest has happened because an event becomes known through various media sources. Now, that's not entirely true, James, because we have many, many sources that supplement those media sources. But can Andrea comment on the events that may have been prevented through the use of newer technologies, such as open source intelligence or social media intelligence? Thank you very much. Good question. Andrea, all yours.
Yeah, on the sourcing, I'd say, I mean, I had some conversations around these, and I'd say that perhaps it's about how sources report on these events, in the sense that when we studied this work, and studied especially our work on Europe, together with our partner in Italy, Avviso Pubblico, has been doing this job for over a decade. And so they are kind of trained, but also because Italy has been very paying, I'd say, attention to this phenomenon for quite a while. One of the main questions that we had to pose ourselves also in presenting the findings was to what extent, for example, countries that understand these events as, again, threats to democracy or being, again, an important element of the political life of communities, report on them. Because sometimes, sorry, they just fall through the cracks of local news, or they are not given the importance that in some other countries may be. And this is, I think, a very kind of important question. I think our methodology should be able to capture. Of course, we don't know about what is not reported, but our methodology tries to, I'd say, catch a very large net of as many outlets as possible reporting on relevant news. But I'd say that it's even, national institutions that sometimes struggle to capture these phenomena, because sometimes it's not even reported. It's sometimes may be considered as almost a routine component of being a member of a local administration, while in fact it is not. Is actually an abuse sometimes that is carried out on local officials. When it comes to prevention measures, well, of course, talking about prevention is very, at least globally, is very difficult, because the drivers of these violences are diverse, I'd say, even within countries, not just across countries. I'd say that there is definitely increasing attention on this phenomenon in Europe and beyond. I was just reading some reports, for example, from the Philippines, that where there is an alarm over the increasing number of attacks. Of course, in Mexico, one of the things, again, there is research on this topic, but like one element that has provided more security to local officials is, the role of federal troops in being deployed to local communities. Of course, the problem there is about the resources, and often like the alignment between the national level and the local level, and to what extent there is a willingness or a capability or a capacity to do that. Sometimes when it comes to, for example, Italy has had a kind of many years to develop legislation to tackle particularly the infiltration of organized crime in local communities, in municipalities and so on. And this legislation has sometimes allowed to actually break the tie that exists, or kind of the coexistence of politics and organized crime, or crime kind of at large. And other countries are trying to do the same. I mentioned France, but also we could say about the United States. There was increasing concern, especially in the past few years, about the role of election workers and the threats and the harassment that election workers have been facing since 2020 and 2021. And as far as I could read and I could study, I saw that there has been an increasing investment by the federal government and by the states to provide security, even though it's very difficult sometimes to carry out investigation, because at least in this case, when it comes to harassment, it's of course very difficult to put a limit between what is freedom of speech and what is harassment in this case. But the problem is to what extent that then harassment or threats may become violent and may become physical and turn real.
So that's really interesting. So at the moment we have kind of more security and order and potentially even less impunity around these types of crimes when they do happen. And acknowledging it, of course, being central, which I hope this report starts to do more systematically. And then in the larger scope, I think that the intra-party competition that you mentioned that's fueling a lot of this in the Philippines, in South Africa, etc., becomes too costly for elites to bear before they start to reconsider this modality of achieving power. That's been brilliant, Andrea. I really enjoyed the report. Please, everybody, feel free both to download the report or the data itself, as Andrea mentioned in the beginning. Any final words, Andrea, that you would like to offer?
I'd say, of course, feel free to engage with us, to reach out to us with any questions. We are actively trying to make sure that this work expands as much as possible. We're trying to engage with our partner network. Like there are many local organizations that are doing great work, and what we'll try to do in the future, we'll also trying to make sure that there are more, I'd say, regional, cross-organization conversations about this topic, which again, I think can benefit a lot from disseminating knowledge. And there are organizations that have been working on this topic for decades, have a lot to share, have a lot of best practices that can be implemented. So I think along with our research, we'll also try to work on connecting these knowledge and us to provide as much as we can, like the most realistic and solid understanding on this topic. So
Wonderful.
thank you for.
That's certainly good marching orders for us to do so. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. And like I said, please feel free to go to our website and engage with us either directly through emails or otherwise. And again, I will hopefully see you next time in our next webinar. Everybody, goodbye. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And of course, for everybody for helping put this on. Thank you.